Damn Cam here with Damn Talk. Actually, with a public service announcement. If you live in one of the major U.S. cities that has held pro-Palestinian demonstrations over the last week, New York included, we encourage you to be very, very careful. We're talking about even Kirkland, Washington, our old stomping grounds, have held big rallies in support for the the terrorist group that has paraglided in and killed all sorts of innocent civilians, all in the name of a territorial dispute, not a military conflict. Now, this doesn't matter as much as the fact that one of the lead terrorists has issued a call for all Muslims to commit jihad on Friday the 13th, seeing as how there are a lot of Muslims in the United States. Be careful, all right? We don't claim to know the truth, and we will put our ignorance on display, asking you to join us at thatdamntalkspot.locals.com.
God avenge their blood, in which he said that Hamas, in some ways, they are worse than Nazis, which some viewed as a very provocative statement. Why did you say that about them?
The Nazis, here's a phrase I'll never use again, at least the Nazis. So at least the Nazis attempted to hide their crimes. So the Nazis obviously mechanized death. They had Einsatzgruppen units that drove up to Jewish villages and would mow people down. And then they would bury them, and then they would try to hide the crimes. And it took the Nuremberg team years to undig all of that material. In this particular case, you have Hamas terrorists who are murdering Jews in their beds and then live streaming it and celebrating it and bragging about it and talking about how incredible it is and blasting that sort of stuff out. The videos that I've been showing on my show, a lot of them are coming directly from Hamas. It's Hamas that is taking contemporaneous video of this sort of stuff. And that's a whole new level of evil. To celebrate this sort of stuff, to treat it as a triumph. I think the thing that people really have to realize here is this is not a military operation. This was not a military operation. People have compared this to, for example, the 1973 Yom Kippur War. That was an awful moment in Israel's history when it was taken by surprise by the combined Arab armies around it. But that was a military operation with a military objective, which was to seize territory. This is not a military operation with a military objective. This was an operation directed specifically at civilians. And when we see death in Gaza, which we're going to see, and the images are going to be horrifying and terrible, it is important to understand that the reason that is happening is not just because Hamas crossed the border and murdered a bunch of civilians in their beds, but also because Hamas literally hides its weaponry behind civilians. Israel is currently, right now, sending out messages to Gazan civilians, telling them to get out of particular areas. And Hamas is sending out full-scale messages, telling people to ignore those messages and to stay where they are. Now, Hamas there's a reason why their headquarters were for years located underneath a hospital. It's what they understand that the West, again, has a peculiar narcissism where we think we would never put our military hardware below a hospital. That'd be insane. And so if Israel blows up a hospital, it must be that Israel's doing that because they're targeting civilians. Hamas knows that. That's why they're doing it. That's why they're doing it. They literally hide their rocket launchers behind apartment buildings in the hope that Israel will strike back and have to kill civilians in the process. Israel cares significantly more about civilian casualties in Gaza than Hamas ever has.
There have been so many horrendous images and videos. The poor girl from the music festival taken away on the motorbike was just bone-chilling to watch. I saw something on CNN yesterday with Jake Tapper where he's interviewing the relative of his grandmother, who was murdered, and Hamas posted the video of her being murdered onto her Facebook page so her family would watch it. When you hear that, it's sort of unconscionable. It's kind of beyond depravity. This is inhumanity.
Piers, you're in the business of words, and I'm in the business of words, and I've found myself repeatedly over the last few days unable to find words to describe the kind of thing that we're seeing. And again, we stretch, I think, in the West, and I stretch as an American. I think we all stretch to try and find, what would drive somebody to do something like this. And the answer sometimes is that they're I don't know how to say this otherwise. They are not like you. Hamas is not like you. They don't think like you. They don't have the same priorities as you. They don't have the same values as you. And that means that any attempt to buy them off is bound to fail. And this is inextricably intertwined with the history. The fact is, Israel turned over the Gaza Strip in 2005. There were no Jews living in the Gaza Strip since 2005. The areas that were attacked in this particular terrorist attack are not areas that are in the so-called settlements, the Shtachim, in Judea, Samaria, what's called the West Bank. That's not the area that was attacked. The area that was attacked has been sovereign Israeli territory since 1947-48. And that territory was attacked from across a border that is entirely controlled by Hamas, which has utilized pretty much every dollar that has flooded into that region over the course of 20 years from America, from Europe, taxpayer dollars that have been used to build up these terror capabilities. Every time there are cement shipments into the area ruled by Hamas, Hamas has used it to build terror tunnels. Pipes that have been sent into the area ruled by Hamas that were meant to build sewage systems have been repurposed and used for rocket tubes. I mean, it's utterly insane. And to try and come up with some sort of territorial solution, this is really just a territorial dispute. It is not a territorial dispute. It is a genocidal group that makes clear its own intentions. I don't know how many times people have to tell you who they are before we believe them.
Is the reaction of the world when George Floyd was murdered, which was a despicable killing, and the police officer concerned is now serving a life sentence, quite rightly. But that sparked enormous global protests over America, over the UK, everywhere, with people marching in protest at what they perceived to be a racist murder of one person. And yet the reaction within hours of what happened here, where, as we knew at the time, nearly 1,000 people in Israel had been murdered, some in the most utterly horrific circumstances. The reaction was that, yes, there were big protests again, but they weren't really protests, they were marches of celebration. In America, in the UK, they marched down my local high street, celebrating what had happened, pro-Palestinian marches. I found that extraordinary.
Jew hatred is a very real thing. It's a very real thing. And we've obscured it with a lot of talk about Zionism and anti-Zionism, and we've obscured it with a lot of talk about geopolitics and context. But in the end, Jew hatred is quite real. And when you see crowds in Sydney chanting, "Gas the Jews," not free the occupied territories, not make a peace deal, gas the Jews, I'm not sure what we're supposed to read into that other than people mean what they say when they say gas the Jews.
A lot of people slaughtered, continue to be slaughtered. Is there not a contradiction there that these Republicans would be full square behind Israel when it happens to them, but not full square behind Ukraine?
I mean, yes, there's a contradiction. It depends on sort of what is being said about Ukraine, and it runs the gamut. And some of the candidates that you've talked about have talked about ending aid completely to Ukraine. Some have talked about continuing aid to Ukraine and pursuing some sort of deal with the Russians that allows them to keep part of the Donbass and Crimea, which I think is a completely different story and is an actual off-ramp. But yes, anybody who is sympathetic to Russia in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and then is sympathetic to Israel in this current conflict, that is a bizarre position to take. And again, I think that they're serious. America's a sovereign country. It has its own concerns that are not Israel's concerns, and it has its own concerns that are not Ukraine's concerns, and those zones always line up. But when it comes to a possible contradiction between a completely isolationist position on Ukraine and an interventionist position or a supportive position on Israel, of course, those things could clearly be in conflict. In my own position, by the way, for what it's worth, since as you know, Piers, I do this for a living, my own position on Ukraine has been that the United States should continue to supply Ukraine with the support necessary in order to preserve its government and to preserve its territory. And meanwhile, there need to be serious talks about what exactly an off-ramp looks like in Ukraine, because virtually no one has spelled out exactly what that looks like. And virtually no one believes at this point that Ukraine is going to be able to completely take back both the Donbass and the Crimea region. That is not
it's
nearly
very complicated.
The same thing as cut off funding
having been to Ukraine and interviewed President Zelensky, and met a lot of people there, and that was quite a while ago. There was an unbelievably steely resolve, and I would say the same resolve that Israel has about ceding any land now to the Palestinians. It's like they just don't want to give an inch of land away to the Russians. That was to a man and woman that I met out there.
I have an enormous amount of sympathy for that position. Again, that position does not necessarily dictate American policy.